Good afternoon. Thank you so much for your participation. Thank you for coming out today. I'd like to give a very special thank you to the leadership of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. We continue on in their stead every day. I'd like to thank my dear friend, Kevin Kimball, for his great work and the idea behind this policy summit. Our community, the African American community, needs a policy summit, something urgent and fierce. There's a lot of agendas that are going on in Washington, and you hear things very specific. Funding for Ukraine, which is very important. Funding for Israel, which is very important. Funding for defense of Taiwan, very important. But we also need funding for housing, funding for urban investment, funding for entrepreneurs of African American descent. And we have to be very specific, very precise in our language. And so please don't let people tell you that now is not the time. Now is the time. It's been past time. Congresswoman Maxine Waters had proposed a $150 billion plan on housing. And that could have gone through with the American Build Back Better plan, with the American Rescue Act. That would have solved the nation's housing problems. What Governor Greg Abbott is now doing in 6 urban cities that have African American mayors, transporting people from the border of Texas to Los Angeles, to Denver, to Chicago, to Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, New York City, and to Boston. He is trying to blow the budgets through those cities. In the city of Chicago, we've got 35,000 migrants. The city has big shoulders and is very welcoming, but 35,000 people have come into the Chicago, if you will, social service system that is unsustainable. We already had a homeless problem. We already had a housing burden problem. We have the most lead lines of any major city in the entire nation, and we have an infrastructure problem. What he is doing, I have written a letter out to Homeland Security and to the Department of Justice asking them to investigate Governor Greg Abbott on child smuggling. You cannot move people around in our domestic shores without any identification, without any parents in their guardian. That's a problem. So we also need enforcement of the law. Last night we saw the president speak, and we continue to have to challenge the president. This week, this is the week of Bloody Sunday, that everyone says was credited with making America a true democracy and passing of the Civil Rights Act, that we could end the ban on blacks and participation in our voting blocks. Well, if you go down to Selma, Selma looks worse today than it did in the 1960s. So we have to stop all of this jibber jabber and all this talk, and we don't see any action. So when we talk about our participation, access to capital is the next frontier. And let me tell you why we need the policy summit. And this is how things are going in a basket. Just a big picture just for one moment. And I can't thank you enough, Kevin, for your leadership. After slavery had been abolished, the 13th Amendment was created. And it says you are no longer enslaved unless you are duly convicted. So therefore, if you go into a prison, you are no longer a citizen. You have been duly convicted. You've lost your right to citizenship. Then the 14th Amendment came along, which says now you have the right to equal protection under the law. If you've been freed from slavery and still can't get your services from your government, in fact, you're in a form of slavery. Then the 15th Amendment came after the 14th, and that said you now have the right to vote. Those are also called the slave amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. They move in tandem. Where are we right now? When your right to vote is not protected, when you can be criminalized for giving water or food to someone that's standing in line in the state of Georgia, that means your right to vote is not protected. When you can have a former president of the United States calling down to a Secretary of State's office in the state of Georgia saying, I need 11,780 votes. He is trying to manipulate the voting process. When you have an insurrection where the President of the United States could not come out on the mall and greet the American people when he was sworn in as the President of the United States because there was treasonous activity within the government, People in the military, they weren't sure who was going to protect the president. That's called treasonous activity. When you have the state of Colorado say this man has violated the 14th Amendment and had taken him off the ballot, and you've got a federal judiciary that says we don't deal with broad issues. We like to deal with things that are narrowly defined. But now they've weighed in and made a broad decision saying states' rights, has now been trumped by federal rights because we want the president to be protected to get on the ballot. So I wrote a letter, Brother Keevan, that simply states there may be a it may be a silver shadow in this cloud, because if they're protecting the right for Donald Trump to get on the ballot, what about the 1.4 million African American men that have been kicked out of losing their citizenship and they no longer have the right to vote? So we need to make sure that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment go hand in hand. When you don't have the right to vote, only eligible voters can get on our jury pools. When you don't have the right to vote and you don't have equal protection under the law because you've not been able to make sure that you can get a jury of your peers, that means you are now in a function of slavery all over again. We're seeing the biggest rollback in our rights in a generation. What started off on, are you pro-life or anti-life? Are you pro-life or pro-choice? Don't be confused on that. That is not what's really being said. Now that they're talking about in vitro fertilization, the issue is about women's reproductive health care. It's about a woman being a right to choose what's best for her health care. It's about a family being able to plan and not have to have the government in your doctor's office or have a letter from your attorney in your doctor's office when you have to have medical care. It's not about pro-life and pro-choice. It's much bigger than that. So I am so honored to be a part of this today, and many of our students now are doing things better than ever, and yet they're being locked out because of some discriminatory algorithms. Now racism and Jim Crow has gone high tech. They have found their way into regression analysis, they have found their way into algorithms, and now they are coming up in all of these formulas for AI. We saw the big suit with CVS, where the darker you are, the more criminal you look on their software that's looking for criminals. So this is the next frontier that we're having to confront at the same time. So our bandwidth is being stretched. And so I am so excited for each of you coming out here today to be a part of this. We have to fill this auditorium up. We have to remember the bridge that we crossed to get here. We have another bridge to cross. General Federal Ku Klux Klansman Edmund Pettus still lives to this day. They put his name on that bridge 20 years after he had died. A former Ku Klux Klanman, Edmund Pettus, a former Confederate general, they put his name on that bridge to continue to try to strike fear and intimidation into our hearts. But now, look at where we are in 2024. We are in the Capitol Visitor Center, not on that Selma Bridge, that same bridge that crosses the Alabama River, where our people were bought and sold and came up from Mobile all the way up into Georgia. Alabama was a very particular place because you could transport African Americans up and down the coast, up and down the interior part of the country. And I just don't call somebody a slave. I say an American that was enslaved. I don't know what just a slave is. My grandmother was not born a slave. She was an American that someone did not validate, but she was always God's child and didn't need to be validated. She still is somebody. So I need you to believe that in your heart of hearts. And so now you're in the Capitol Visitor Center, and this is also called Emancipation Hall. All of these persons that couldn't get into the main statuary hall, now you can see Frederick Douglass's bust in there. You can see our Native American history. You can see women that weren't originally in statuary hall. So we have made progress, but we cannot let this go back, and it's going back on our watch. We are now being affected with some things that our culture has never seen before. Black teen suicide. Our children are looking for oxygen. Our children are looking for hope. They don't know which way to go. And I'm telling you, some things go back the old-fashioned way. And that's why I'm so honored to be a part of the SCLC. You can't Facebook everything, post everything, Twitter everything or X everything. I don't know what Musk has now called that device and that platform. Some things are hand-to-hand combat. Some things are boots on the ground. Some things are putting yourself in these seats so we fill it up and we have a moment so that we can talk and communicate and have a policy summit. So once again, thank you so much, Brother Kevin. Honored that you came out today.
Thank you, Congressman.
Just one last thing. I feel oftentimes more like a man in the Congress than a congressman. I feel very comfortable in this setting. This is where I come from. This is where my heart is. Kevin and I have got 30 years of friendship and this work together. So let's do our part to fill this auditorium up. And this is where people end up in the Congress coming from those chairs, all right, and those pews. Let's bring our children out so they can learn how to advocate for themselves.
Thank you.
Bye, babe.
Thank you.